With everything finalized and ready for testing, it was time for Dean to fire up the game with the newly sent over voice files and wait for the big moment of celebration that the work was finally finished. Until, well, there was this little bug in the system that would cause the entire screen to go blank on boot for upwards of a minute with not so much as a single loading animation, rendering it unable to release in its current state. The issue was clearly the voice files which had been shipped over, but with absolutely no clue on how to fix such a bug on a large scale, thoughts raced across his mind like lightning on what this could mean. With over 40 voice actors and animated portraits for over 40 characters and 1,700 lines, he thought to himself, there's only one option left. I feel that I can safely say that for us gamers, especially those who have development experience, we all know that making video games and making games as a living is not an easy path to take. Whether it is making games with pixel art or 3D, single or multiplayer, the entire process can be both extremely time-consuming and energy draining. But this is especially the case for new developers with high hopes and dreams of seeing their game played and appreciated by the masses. And few people truly understand the challenges and sacrifices needed in game development like Dean Dodrill, who from 2008 through 2012 experienced as many of the highs as the lowest of lows in his 4 years of working on his most well-known title, Dust and Elysian Tale, which was also the first game he released as the sole owner and operator of his studio, Humble Hearts. Though he started his development in 2008, I first need to take you back to the year 1995 in Denver, Colorado, where Dean would attend classes at Rocky Mountain College of Art and Design, where for 2 years he would expand his skills in illustration, which he had pretty much already taught himself a pretty good amount of years prior. He figured an associate's degree would help him in his illustration and animation career path. And for Dean, he also had great passion for gaming, which first started when he was a kid and his family bought a standalone Pong machine, as well as when he got to game on the TI-9948 computer. Playing Mario for the first time was truly a moment that caused his sense of wonder and creativity to expand massively, and this will lead him to have great appreciation for gaming. So you can imagine his excitement when, while in college, he landed some animation contract work with a gaming company then named Epic Mega Games. That's right, the same company that will go on to be renamed Epic Games. And so 19-year-old Dean got to work closely with talented game artists, designers, and programmers, including Cliff Bleszinski, to bring together cinematics for the 1998 game Jazz Jackrabbit 2. Unfortunately, due to low sales, the third game wasn't considered for the Epic team, but Dean believed in the future of the franchise, so he gathered a few of his friends to put together a demo of what a third entry would look like, and pitched it to Epic. This was an awesome experience, as they were flown out to E3 in 1999 by the Epic team to show off what they had. The demo looked and ran well, which would have impressed them to the point of taking the sequel seriously, if it weren't for the fact that they were kind of focused on their new Unreal game engine, which took off after the first Unreal game in 1998. This brought his contract work to an end, but for Dean, this was incredible early experience and insight into the gaming industry. He immediately used his experience and high of excitement to pin down some ideas for a game that he thought making. He spent a good deal of time working on gaming concepts, but at the time, he had zero programming experience, and thus the project didn't go anywhere, at least not from a gaming standpoint. You see, Dean may not have had the programming skills necessary yet, but what he did have working in his favor was his skills as an artist and animator. And so he took his gaming idea and transformed it into a different medium, an animated film. He would retain the same name as the game at that point, which was titled Elysian Tale. This pet project of his that was started in the early 2000s was inspired by the many works of animation that he grew up watching. In fact, the name Elysian Tale is a direct reference to ex-Disney animator Don Bluth in his 1986 film An American Tale. The work on Dean's film took many years as it was a side project for him, and he had other work that needed to take priority, as he had his family that he needed to take care of. He put up a trailer video for his progress and showcasing some cool action scenes and CGI work, all done by himself, which was very impressive. But unfortunately, that's about as far as he took it since then. But fortunately, he didn't let it all go to waste, but instead he decided on a different yet familiar path. In 2008, while reading the official Xbox magazine, Dean came across an article covering the potential of their new programming language called XNA, which was also a set of tools that allowed any developer to program for Windows games, the Zune, y'all remember that? And for the Xbox 360. This brought forth a long-harbored desire to take gaming seriously and pick up from where he had left off long ago. Except this time he had much more to go on, but still a steep hill to climb as far as programming. Dean's idea was to tell his wife that he would take about 3 months off to learn programming and make a small indie game to release on Xbox Indie Games channel. Yeah, 3 months. Inspiration for Dean came in the form of some games that he had grown up playing, like Castlevania, Super Metroid, and Ninja Gaiden. His favorite games being Ys 1 and 2. These games hold many of the elements that will make up Dust, including side-scrolling platforming action, and map areas accessible after unlocking special items or abilities. And for the visual look and feel of the game, he was very inspired by the animated film The Secret of Nim. And in the words of Dean, I really liked the juxtaposition of this colorful, cute art style and this really dark story, which you really don't see so much in animated films these days. The original idea for him was to make a kind of 8-bit Castlevania game with humans. But this changed pretty quickly, especially since he knew he could make something look more interesting with his artistic background and talents. Dean utilized his office resources, including an animation light table, scanners, and Wacom drawing tablets. After downloading the XNA tools and setting up his home office, Dean was ready to take the first steps to learning game design. His learning consisted of some online tutorials at first, but after realizing that much of the information wasn't directly applicable to his goals and vision, he started reading a book called Building XNA 2.0 Games, a practical guide for independent game development, which was written by James Silva, a game developer himself, known best at the time for his title The Dishwasher on Xbox Live Arcade. Before this, Dean had only learned to work within a blocky tile editor, but after reading James's book, he had far more room to create organic, animated worlds and concepts. This changed Dean's viewpoint for what was possible, and there was even a clear vision that began seeping into his mind. Dean recalls this moment saying, "That was the eye-opening moment for me," and an image of a mysterious turquoise character running through a beautiful forest along a herd of deer cemented itself into my brain. The very first element of the game that Dean created was the main protagonist Dust, who he wanted to have a simple, easily viewable frame with exaggerated, Disney-like movements. Animating him was very time-consuming, as he wanted to make sure not only that the movements were fluid, but that the shading was also high quality and realistic. He had to do separate CG animation work for his sword weapon, which had a big role in the game. The working title for the game was Dust, but to make his game more searchable and include tie-ins with his previous work, he changed it to Dust and Elysian Tale. Now, diving more into the technical side of things, James Silva's book was really coming in handy for Dean, as it helped him to create his own level editor that made it easier to not only implement his artwork from what he had crafted on his Wacom tablet, but also implement scaling and background layer movement. When it came to the creation of the game's companion Fidget, Dean initially only thought about making her a contrasting partner for Dust, who would only really serve to move the story along. But after showing his brother the maps and sprites that he'd put together, the two joked about a certain what-if scenario. We joked about how funny it would be if the world around you were sucked into a spin move I had animated, since it was technically possible if not a bit ridiculous. It dawned on me that I could expand on the simple throw axe what have you of Castlevania and do something flashy with projectiles. And thus, after some experiments, the Dust Storm was born. In 2009, Xbox would hold its Dream Build Play competition, which gave some great opportunities for new developers. And once Dean found out about this, he took his project far more seriously. In fact, once he had a decently working build, he sought out composers instead of keeping his basic sound effects in the game. He saw the talents of Alexander Brandon, who worked with him on Jazz Jackrabbit 2. Brandon had built up a pretty impressive portfolio at the time, composing soundtracks for Unreal, Unreal Tournament, and Deus Ex. He provided numerous soundtracks for Dust, but Dean was unable to bring him on full time. Turns out this wasn't a problem at all, as Dean, who was very active on the XNA Creatives Club forums, would attract the attention of up-and-comer game composer Chris Gehan, and subsequently his partner Dan. These two would make up Hyperduck Soundworks, an incredibly talented group that also did music compositions for Eastward, which we covered in the last video. Dean decided to enter his early Dust build in the Xbox Dream Build Play competition, just to see how his game would fare and get some overall feedback going forward. Competition was fierce as there were over 350 entries from developers in over 100 countries. They were all vying for the share prize of $75,000, with the grand prize winner receiving a take-home of $40,000 and a chance to have their game published and featured on the Xbox Live Indie Games channel. Dean really didn't have the highest of hopes submitting his file for the contest. In fact, on the day of, during the announcement, he had fallen asleep. Now, this was due to him being a night owl for so long, but imagine his surprise when he was woken up by his family upstairs, who were celebrating him winning the grand prize, as not only fans, but the team at Xbox themselves acknowledged the fun gameplay and high potential of Dust. Not only was this an exciting and life-changing moment for him, but this was a moment of validation for him that he had chosen the right path, and all of his hard work was going to pay off in the end. But all of this excitement was cut short rather quickly, as within only a few hours, Dean received a devastating phone call that his grandmother, who had been in a hospital for a while, had just passed away. This was the start of the contrasting and conflicting emotional roller coaster that his development would go through over the next few years of extreme highs and extreme lows. Dean had of course taken some time to be with his family in mourning, but there wasn't a whole lot of time to do so, as there was so much work that needed to get done after winning the contest. Now, if you remember, I said that the winner had the chance to have their games featured on Xbox Live. So this wasn't even a guarantee, and it was up to Dean to work even harder to show and prove to Microsoft that he was dedicated and committed to producing a polished product with timely updates throughout. And it was up to Microsoft to ultimately decide the fate of the game, and if it would be fitting for them to publish and host it on their Xbox Live Arcade platform. The prize money did provide a huge boost for him to financially support the game's development, but it was up to him and his family to self-fund the game from their savings. So there was no resources to spend on any kind of luxuries. So as things kind of calmed down, Dean returned to his at-home office space to continue working on his own, and with the music composers. A month later, though, Microsoft got in closer contact with him and followed his progress. Throughout the months, Dean pitched more of his game's story and features to Microsoft, which further impressed them. The Microsoft team did have a vision for the quality that they wanted in their indie space, and with a previous indie title like Braid that was super successful, they believed that Dust could be another big hit. And so, after signing contracts, Dean was officially set to have his game appear on the Xbox Live Arcade. Microsoft even assigned him a producer, Andrew Williams, to help him with not only providing feedback, but also getting an official announcement trailer out for E3 2010. During this time, Andrew and the Microsoft team definitely had lots of praise to give Dean on how the game was shaping up. But they also had some issues with certain parts, namely the writing. Well, this soon became an ongoing theme that Dean would seriously need to address, as you'll soon see. Shortly after the release of the E3 trailer, Dean received an introductory email from Alex Kane, a designer and writer at the time, at a mobile gaming studio called Venon Entertainment. Alex wanted to reach out directly to praise his work, but also to inquire about Dean's design process. The two discussed just about everything from Dust to their early and ongoing experience in the video games industry. It really didn't take long for them to bond, especially after discovering that Dean was a big fan of the iOS game Space Miner, which Alex had a major writing role in. Dean would later trust him enough to send him over a working build of the game, along with a questionnaire, as was typical for anyone doing game testing, to get his thoughts as a writer and designer. Prior to this, the only individuals who he would allow to see the game were those in the Xbox Live indie games community, which really goes to show the great impression Alex had on him. Though Dean would grow to become friends with both Andrew and Alex, there was a big difference in his experience talking to and getting feedback from Alex. He wasn't afraid to tell him like it is and give him blunt and straightforward feedback. Alex's initial thoughts provided positive and encouraging feedback, but there was just one looming issue that Alex brought up that wasn't new to Dean at all. It was the writing. And coming from someone who had an actual professional writing background, this took Dean by surprise. But Dean still felt confident in his ability and what he had achieved so far, and couldn't put his stubbornness and pride to the side so that he could realize the true power of writing and how it could transform his game, at least not yet anyway. Dean wouldn't be won over until the moment he saw early in the game how Alex's writing skill was much needed. Alex showed Dean the difference between using a few different words here and there, and that was enough to break down his walls. But Dean wasn't too happy about that. Dean took a few more months contemplating and really just dragging out the inevitable, but he would eventually acknowledge his need in this area, thinking, if I really care about this project, I'll overlook my personal weaknesses and bring Alex on. And so he would hire Alex Kane on as a writer for the game in 2011. In addition, per Microsoft's feedback, Dean and Chris Gehan would search to find voice actors for the characters in the game. Chris, having more connections in the industry, would reach out and bring aboard Devin Mack, founder of Toon Platoon Casting. Devin agreed to lend his support, and they even expanded their conversation and vision to work towards hiring a whole crew of actors for the game. The final game would include over 40 actors lending their voices for over 1,700 lines. Both Dean and Alex continued to make some progress with the game, but between making story changes and rewriting sections of the game, the major issue was that the story as a whole was largely unfinished going into the new year. In fact, Dean estimated that only about 20% of the game was finished, and with the major stress that he felt the game was having on his family life at home, he shuddered to even think about the possibility of another year or more of putting his family through all of this. But he also didn't want to risk pushing the game back to 2013 and risk getting eaten alive by the major titles coming out early in that year. There was definitely a light of hope at the end of the tunnel, and one major event that would soon provide some great relief and more validation for his journey thus far, and of course, an equal amount of stress to go along with it. In 2012, Microsoft welcomed Dean to show a demo at Pax East in April. They even flew him out to Boston, which was an incredible bonus. In addition, Dean and Alex King got to meet for the first time and experience the show together. Microsoft had the booth all set up for him, but Dean didn't really expect much in the way of gamer interest, especially since there were other interesting games nearby set to release on Xbox Live Arcade. There were a few groups of gamers that swung by here and there, but it wasn't until members of Giant Bomb came over to talk and play his game that things changed drastically. You see, they had their own panel at PAX East with tons of fans, but once they mentioned and gave praise to Dust, the snowball started to roll, as he had begun attracting many other well-known gaming media members, including Mike from Penny Arcade, and even reconnecting with Cliff Bleszinski, who of course had nothing but high praise for the game. Next thing he knew, there were lines of over an hour long to play Dust. Microsoft, in their excitement, saw a huge opportunity for Dean and his title, seeing all the hype that the game had generated over the past few days at PAX East. The game was already set to release on Xbox Live Arcade, but they offered him a spot on the Summer of Arcade to release in August. August, as in 4 months from now, August. Dean had planned for at least 6 more months of development, and so the thought of condensing it down to less than 4 was not easy to even consider. And of course, Dean wouldn't give an answer on the spot like that. He needed to think things over, talk to his family, pray about it, and really get his head on right and consider the increase in sacrifice that he had to make on top of what he had already given up. Not to mention considering that the game was nowhere near finished, and not to mention him and his wife were expecting their 3rd child in just 2 months. But there was so much upside to the idea of having a finished game ready for summer, as the hype generated at PAX East would mean tons of potential sales. Dean said, "I knew it was going to destroy me, mentally and physically, but this was not something I could say no to." And he did just that. He agreed on a deal with Microsoft, and off to work he went. And off the wheels came. Dean would increase his workload to 18 hours per day, working to speed up development time, but after having some conversations with Alex, the reality and gravity of the situation started to set in, and Dean realized that the only way to see his game through would be to cut some of the story content of which he had worked on tirelessly for many years, even before Dusk was turned into a game. The game initially called for 2 antagonists and a third act that Alex convinced Dean to shelve in favor of tying up the story they had thus far and creating alternative stories in certain areas. Story elements that were taken out included mini map areas and even correlating music that had already been written. But the final game still included over 230 handcrafted maps. You'd also be surprised to know what was also planned to be in the game. There were actually a lot more non-competitive plans, such as owning property, farming, fishing, and so on. I'd spent a lot of time planning these features, and perhaps even more problematically, envisioning them naturally as parts of the game in my head. Though the game was all coming together, the development cycle and pressure would take a huge toll on him physically and mentally. We already brought up the fact that weekends basically didn't exist for Dean, but on some days, eating and drinking was also foreign, as he worked all the way up until release. In his words, food would literally be placed in front of me, and I would still forget to eat. Tending to his stomach would be the least of his concerns during this time, as his wife was set to give birth in June. But after she was born, Dean literally got maybe 2 hours to spend with her during the first couple weeks of her life. Thankfully, there was only one task left for the development of the game, and that was crafting the animated cutscenes, which, with the time constraints, almost didn't happen. He was contemplating removing them completely, doing motion comic style cutscenes, which he was completely turned off by, or doing what he calls the limited animation technique, similar to anime, which is something he'd have to learn on his own fast, as he was only used to animating larger scale films at different frame rates. Dean made his decision and got to learning how to create limited animation in a pretty short amount of time. Again, working 18 to 20 hours, he got to fit a lot of work in, but Dean did manage to finish 6 whole minutes of animated cutscenes in just a few weeks, just in time before the game's certification process. With everything finalized and ready for testing, it was time for Dean to fire up the game with the newly sent over voice files and wait for the big moment of celebration that the work was finally finished. Until, well, there was this little bug in the system that would cause the entire screen to go blank on boot for upwards of a minute with not so much as a single loading animation, rendering it unable to release in its current state. The issue was clearly the voice files which had been shipped over, but with absolutely no clue on how to fix such a bug on a large scale, thoughts raced across his mind like lightning on what this could mean. With over 40 voice actors and animated portraits for over 40 characters and 1,700 lines, he thought to himself, there's only one option left. Cut out every single voice file in the game and contact all of the voice actors and audio producers who worked tirelessly on the game for over a year and tell them that it was all for nothing. Just the thought of this frightening possibility left Dean to completely break down emotionally and mentally. In his own words, I broke down crying. It honestly felt like losing a loved one. Somewhere in the midst of his breakdown, Dean thankfully managed to fall asleep, and this is where the miracle happens. A few hours later, which was the norm at the time, I woke up, seemingly having reprogrammed the entire dialogue system in my dreams, as well as a new way to load all content, and was able to get everything working again. Sleep is powerful, but for Dean, this incredible moment came at the perfect time. The game was shipped out to Microsoft, and thankfully the game was met with tons of positive reviews and feedback. For Dean, reflecting on his experience and first outing as a full-fledged game developer, is thankful first for the relationships and long-lasting friendships he's built over the years. He's also thankful that through all of his learnings and work, he developed a much deeper appreciation for the medium. But at this point for Dean, he really just wanted to step away for a bit and spend some much-needed time embracing his family. He also wanted to ensure that with his next video game outing, he was able to enjoy the process and experiment, which are things that were nearly absent with the creation of Dust. Speaking of his next outing, he did go on to lend his hand on other projects and would also produce his next title in 2018 called Never Stop Sneaking. Currently, Dean and his family still reside in Colorado, and he is working towards a yet-to-be-announced project. Looking back on the epic journey behind Dust and Elysian Tale, Dean has one wish for those who come across his story, and that is, in his own words, to find the sort of inspiration that got me started those seemingly thousands of years ago.